The dog hit the security door before anyone saw him move. 1 second he was sitting beside the bed, pressed against the rail like a dark anchor, and the next he was airborne. 80 pounds of muscle and instinct slamming into the reinforced frame hard enough to rattle the hinges. The orderly who'd made the mistake of reaching past him stumbled back into the corridor wall and just stood there, clipboard against his chest, breathing. Nobody in Ward 7 said anything. They'd learned not to. The dog's name was Boxer, and he hadn't left Staff Sergeant Owen Truax's side in 11 days. Not when they changed the IV lines. Not when the physical therapist came to assess the damage to Truax's left leg. Not when the chaplain sat in the plastic chair by the window and spoke quietly about things men in that condition sometimes needed to hear. Boxer had tolerated all of it from approximately 18 inches away, head low, amber eyes tracking every pair of hands that came near the bed. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, former 75th Ranger Regiment working dog, and he had not been cleared to be in the hospital at all. The exception had been made on day 2, quietly, by someone 2 pay grades above the ward administrator, after a corpsman had tried to remove the dog and ended up needing 4 stitches on his forearm. The paperwork said the bite had been an accident. Nobody filed a complaint. Boxer stayed. Truax hadn't woken up yet. Iris Colby arrived at Brooke Army Medical Center on a Tuesday in late October, transferred from a Navy hospital in Portsmouth, where she'd spent 3 years working a trauma ward that never quite slept. She was 31 years old, had 17 stitches of scar tissue on her left shoulder from a car accident she didn't like to discuss, and carried her coffee in a thermos that said, "Keep going" in faded block letters, because someone had given it to her during her internship, and she'd never found a good reason to replace it. She was not expecting a dog. The charge nurse, a compact woman named Patterson who walked like someone who'd made peace with difficult things, stopped her outside room 714 before she'd gotten her badge clipped. "One rule before I show you anything else," Patterson said. Room 14. Don't reach over the bed. Iris looked down the corridor. The door was half open. She could see the shape of a man in the bed, one leg elevated, and below the bed rail, sitting on the floor in a posture that looked almost like patience, a brown and black dog with ears like radar dishes. "Is that a Malinois?" "His name is Boxer. The patient is Truax, Owen, Staff Sergeant, Rangers, injured in a training accident 3 weeks ago. IED residue from an earlier deployment is complicating the nerve damage." Patterson said it without effect, the way people say things they've said many times. The dog was his working partner for 4 years. "Someone made a call and Boxer has been here since day 2. What's his status?" "The dog's fine. The patient." Patterson paused just long enough to mean something. "He has good days and bad days. Today he hasn't woken up yet, so we don't know what kind of day it is." Iris looked through the gap in the door again. Boxer hadn't moved. He was watching her with the precise, unblinking attention of something that had decided she was a variable he hadn't yet categorized. "Has he bitten anyone?" "Once. The orderly won't do it again." "Does he let nurses in?" "He lets some nurses in," Patterson said. "We haven't figured out why he accepts some people and not others. Dr. Faraday thinks it's body language. The dog handler from the K9 unit says it's something else." She said the last part like she wasn't sure she believed the handler or Faraday and had arrived somewhere in between that she wasn't ready to name. Iris shifted her thermos to her other hand. "Who's the handler?" "Sergeant Reese. He comes in the evenings. He'll want to talk to you." She didn't ask more questions. She'd learned, over 3 years in trauma, that the rooms that required the most preparation before entry were usually the rooms that ended up teaching her something. She tucked that instinct away and followed Patterson to learn the rest of the ward. She didn't go into room 714 that day. She stood in the doorway at 6 p.m. and watched Boxer lift his head, look at her, and put it back down. She didn't know what to make of that. She went home, heated soup she didn't taste, and thought about it longer than she should have. On the 3rd day, Iris started paying attention to the dog. She'd seen working dogs before. Portsmouth had military cases, and she understood the bond that developed between a handler and an animal trained for that kind of work. But Boxer was operating without his handler during the day, which meant what he was doing wasn't training. It was something older than that. He'd mapped the room into a threat assessment she couldn't read, and he ran it on his own clock, and nobody had been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction why he'd bitten one person and not another, Why he'd let the respiratory therapist in on Monday and wouldn't let the same man pass the doorway on Wednesday. She started keeping notes. Not official ones, just observations, the kind she scribbled in the back of a pocket notebook she'd carried since medical school. Who he let in, the time of day. Whether Truax's vitals had changed in the hours before, she wasn't a behaviorist, she wasn't even sure what she was looking for. What she found after 4 days of notes was something she couldn't put into the official record. Boxer let people in when Truax's blood pressure had been elevated. Not people who came to help, people who arrived before anything was wrong, as if the dog already knew. He was letting in the people who had reason to be there before a crisis, not after. He was working off information nobody had given him. She mentioned this to Sergeant Reese on Thursday evening, standing in the corridor while Reese drank bad coffee from the machine near the elevator. Reese was 38, quiet, with the kind of stillness that came from years of working with animals that could read through noise. He listened to her entire theory without interrupting, which she appreciated. "He's keying on cortisol," Reese said when she finished. "He can smell it?" Working dogs can detect physiological changes before the equipment registers them. Diabetic alert dogs, seizure dogs, they're not magic. They're just paying attention to things humans stopped paying attention to. He looked at his coffee. Boxer was trained for explosive detection and handler protection, but he was with Truax for 4 years. In the field. That's not just scent training anymore. That's something else. What is it? Rise thought about it for a moment. Knowing someone, he said. The way you know someone when you've been through enough with them that you stop using words. She didn't answer that. She thought about it for the rest of her shift. On the 8th day of her rotation, Truax woke up. Not dramatically. That wasn't how it happened, mostly. He surfaced slowly, the way people did when the body was negotiating its own return, and by the time Iris came on shift at 7 in the morning, the charge nurse had already noted that he'd been responsive since around 4 a.m., and was oriented to person and place, asking for water. She went to the room. Boxer was standing when she pushed the door open. Not the low, pressed-forward posture of a threatened animal. Standing straight, weight balanced, watching her with the same amber attention she'd grown used to. She stopped inside the doorway and waited. The dog took 3 steps toward her, stopped and sat. She had no idea what that meant. She looked at the man in the bed. Truax was thin in the way that 11 days of being unconscious makes people thin, the muscle underneath the framework of his face gone soft, but his eyes were clear, green. Watching her with a directness that was startling in someone that recently unconscious. He doesn't usually do that, Truax said. His voice was hoarse. Do what sit? He looked at Boxer. He sits for about 4 people, out of everyone who's come through that door. Iris crossed the room slowly and checked his IV without making any sudden movements she didn't have to. Boxer watched but didn't move. She could feel the dog's attention like a hand on her shoulder. He must have decided you were safe, Truax said. I haven't done anything to earn that. That's not how he decides. Truax shifted against the pillow, winced. He doesn't score it up, he just knows. She finished checking the line. She was about to say something standard, vitals, assessment, the routine, when Truax spoke again. You're new, transferred from Portsmouth 3 weeks ago. Navy background? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She reached to adjust the monitor setting and Boxer moved, not aggressively, just a repositioning, coming to sit at the exact spot between her and the bed that left him able to see both. He's not stopping you, Truax said. He's just making sure he can see. I know, Iris said, and she did by then. She'd read enough of her own notes to understand the architecture of what the dog was doing. Does it bother you, having him here? Truax looked at Boxer for a long moment. Something passed across his face that she didn't try to name. No, he said. He's the only reason I knew something was wrong before the accident. He stopped. Right in the middle of a run. Just locked up. I've never seen him do that. I turned back, and he stopped. If I hadn't turned back when I did, the IED would have been directly under the vehicle. The room was quiet. Down the corridor, a cart moved past, its wheels loud on the linoleum. He saved your life, Iris said. He always does, Truax said. I just didn't listen fast enough this time. She left the room 20 minutes later. Boxer watched her go. She stopped at the door and looked back at him, and the dog held her gaze with the uncomplicated, total attention of something that had decided she was part of the circle now and would not be changing its mind. The man who arrived on day 11 looked wrong. Iris noticed it at 9:40 in the morning when she was charting at the station, and a man in a visitor's badge came off the elevator and turned toward the far corridor with a confidence that was slightly too practiced. Not the hesitance of someone who'd never been here, not the fluency of someone who worked here. Something in between, calibrated, like a posture he'd tried on in a mirror. She watched him turn toward 7:14. She was out from behind the station before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The man, mid-40s, civilian clothes, lanyard with a visitor badge that said Contracted Services, Building D, was halfway through Truax's door when Boxer hit the wall. Not the man, the wall beside the door. The sound was huge in the corridor, the Malinois launching himself off the floor and colliding with the door frame in a controlled explosion of muscle that stopped the man cold in the threshold. Boxer hadn't bitten him. He'd put himself in the space between the door and the bed, and he was standing there, weight forward, not making a sound now, which Iris had learned over 11 days of observation was the version that meant he was not negotiating. The man backed up one step. Iris came through the door behind him. "Can I help you?" she said. It was not a question. "I'm here to check your badge," says Building D. She looked at it. "This is Building C, Ward 7. Contracted services from Building D don't have patient access." A beat. Something recalculated behind his eyes. "I must have the wrong floor. You must have." She held the door. "The elevator's behind you." He left. She watched until he turned the corner, and then she went to the nursing station and called security. She gave them the badge number she'd read off his lanyard. She did it without urgency, without drama, because she'd learned in Portsmouth that the moment you acted alarmed was the moment everyone in the ward felt it. The security officer who called back 20 minutes later said the badge number came back as expired. The badge had been issued 8 months ago to a vendor whose contract had been terminated in the spring. Someone had kept the badge. Someone had known which floor and which room number. Someone had come here with a plan that Boxer had interrupted before it got to the part of the plan that mattered. Patterson came to find her at noon. "Security says you flagged someone. Yes, they're pulling the camera footage." Patterson looked at her steadily. "You want to tell me how you noticed?" He walked like he knew where he was going, but he slowed down before the last door. People who know where they're going don't slow down before the last door. Patterson was quiet for a moment. "And the dog knew before I did," Iris said. "I just knew to watch what the dog was doing." The investigators who came in the afternoon were not from the hospital. They had the particular patience of people whose job required sitting in rooms until other people said things, and they spoke to Iris for 45 minutes in the family consultation room near the elevator bank. She told them what she'd seen. She told them about the badge number. She told them because they asked, and she believed it was relevant, about the notes she'd been keeping on Boxer's behavior patterns, because those notes were part of why she'd been paying attention at all. One of the investigators, a woman named Ingram who had the kind of face that gave nothing away for free, wrote for a long time after Iris finished talking. "The dog let you in early on," Ingram said finally. "Day 3, Iris said. Or the first time I tried the room. Did anything happen that might explain it?" Iris thought about it. She'd thought about it plenty already. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I grew up with dogs. I know not to reach over an animal's head. I know to let them come to you. I know what a working dog posture looks like. Maybe that's all it was. And the notes you kept. I was curious about what he was responding to. He wasn't random. There was a system. I wanted to understand it." Ingram looked at her for a moment. Most people would have just reported the dog as an access problem and moved on. "Most people probably did," Iris said. "I'm not most people." It wasn't a boast. She said it the way she said most things, flat, factual, because she didn't see the point of undercutting something that was simply true. Ingram seemed to understand that because she didn't write it down. She just nodded, once, and turned the page. The person the badge had belonged to was a former vendor employee named Garrett, who'd had access to the building during a period when a patient file had been accessed without authorization. The file was Truax's. The access had happened 7 weeks ago, before Truax was even admitted, which meant someone had known he was coming before he arrived. Ingram told Iris this 3 days later, in the same consultation room with the same flat patients. "He's been a person of interest for 6 weeks, Ingram said. We didn't know he'd try a direct approach. Why Truax? Iris asked, though she had a guess. That's still being worked out. Ingram looked at her hands. What we know is that Staff Sergeant Truax was scheduled to provide testimony in a procurement investigation. Someone wanted that testimony not to happen. The room was quiet. He's going to be all right? Iris asked. Medically, yes. From what I understand, and the other thing, also yes. Ingram allowed herself a small pause, which was the closest she'd come to a facial expression. Partly because a nurse, who should have been charting, was watching an elevator instead. Iris drove home that evening through streets that were starting to come into the wet gold of late autumn, the oak trees dropping color along the service road that ran beside the base perimeter. She thought about Boxer sitting in that room for 11 days, unmovable, certain, running a calculation that no one had programmed him for. She thought about Truax saying he just knows, and about Reese saying knowing someone like it was a thing that happened outside of language. She thought about what it meant to pay attention to something long enough that you started to understand what it was telling you. She stopped at a light. A woman was walking a dog on the far sidewalk, something small and golden, pulling happily toward a fire hydrant, and Iris watched them and felt unexpectedly a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat in the car. On the last day of Truax's active ward stay, 2 weeks after Iris had arrived at BMC, she came into room 714 for the morning check and found him sitting up in the adjusted bed with his laptop open and Boxer lying across his feet, despite the fact that a dog of that size on the feet of a man with nerve damage in one leg should not have been comfortable for either of them. Truax was reading something. He closed the laptop when she came in. "They're discharging me Thursday," he said. "I heard." She checked the monitors. "How's the leg?" "They say 6 months of PT and I'll be close to full function." He said it without bitterness, which impressed her. She'd seen people with less damage become defined by it. Close is fine. Close is enough. Boxer lifted his head as she moved around the bed. He'd stopped tracking her with any tension weeks ago. Now he just looked up, confirmed she was still the person she'd been, and put his head back down. "He likes you," Truax said. "He tolerates me," Iris said. "You don't know what his tolerance looks like, what that is." He nodded at the dog. Supine and radiating calm at her feet is something different. She finished the check. She was about to go when he spoke again, the way he'd gotten into the habit of, as if he saved things for the moment of almost departure. "I want to ask you something," he said. She turned. "Ingram told me what you did, the badge, the notes, all of it." He paused. "She didn't have to tell me, she wanted me to know." Iris waited. "I've had people in this room for 2 weeks," Truax said. "Good people. People who did their jobs and more than their jobs. But you," he stopped, seemed to look for the right word, and settled on something simple. "You were paying attention, real attention. Not to me even, to him." He looked at Boxer, and he knew. Iris thought about all the things she could say. She thought about Reese standing in the corridor saying knowing someone like it was a kind of fluency. She thought about keeping the notebook, the ink notes she'd made in the back of it every evening, trying to understand what the dog was reading in the room. "He did the hard part," she said finally. "I just watched." Truax shook his head slightly. "You watched and you understood what you were watching. That's rarer than you think." She left before the weight of that had time to settle into something she'd have to carry carefully. In the corridor, Patterson was coming the other way with a chart under her arm, and she gave Iris the brief nod that meant good morning and nice work and carry on all at once in the economy of communication that developed between people who worked the same hard hours. Iris carried on. On Thursday, she stood at the nursing station when they brought the wheelchair to 7 and 14. She wasn't watching for it. She had charting to do and 2 other patients to check before noon, but she heard Boxer's nails on the linoleum before she heard anything else, that distinctive clicking strike of a working dog at a purposeful walk, and she looked up. Truax was in the wheelchair, laptop bag on his lap, dressed in the civilian clothes someone must have brought him. He looked like a different person outside the hospital bed, more solid, more present, the frailty of the ward replaced by something that had always been underneath it. Waiting. Boxer was heeling at his left, close, matching the pace of the wheelchair with the automatic precision of 4 years of doing exactly that. They stopped at the station. Truax looked at her. Boxer looked at her. "Thank you," Truax said. "It's my job," Iris said, and then because that was inadequate and she knew it, Take care of each other. Truax
Okay.
smiled. It changed his face entirely, the way some smiles do when they're not performed, something loose and real and briefly younger than the rest of him. That's what we do, he said. They went down the corridor and through the double doors, and then they were gone, the sound of Boxer's footsteps fading with them. Iris looked down at her chart. The corridor was quiet. A new patient had come in on Tuesday, room 709, a Navy corpsman in from Pendleton with a fractured pelvis and 2 broken ribs from a vehicle rollover. He'd be her next admit. She had his file already. She picked up her pen. Down the hall, through the window at the corridor's end, the Texas morning was doing what mornings here did, burning off the overnight cool in layers, the sky going from gray to white to a blue that promised nothing and delivered everything. She'd learned in the weeks she'd been here that the light changed fast in this part of the country, came on strong and direct, didn't ask permission. She was getting used to that. She started writing.